When American soldiers breached the perimeter of a secluded military facility near Pyongyang in late August 1945, they were unprepared for what awaited them inside. The soldiers, part of the advance units of the U.S. Army's 24th Corps, had expected to find Japanese military personnel surrendering after Emperor Hirohito's announcement on August 15th. Instead, they discovered dozens of Korean women, malnourished, injured, and kept in prison-like conditions. These women, some as young as 17, others in their 30s, reacted with a mixture of terror and disbelief at the sight of the American uniforms. For years they had been told Americans would torture them if they were ever captured. Now, faced with actual American soldiers offering medical assistance rather than violence, many couldn't comprehend their suddenly altered reality. These women were survivors of Imperial Japan's systematic sexual enslavement program, what would later be documented as one of the most extensive systems of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in modern warfare. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The liberation of these Korean women, euphemistically called comfort women by the Japanese military, represents a critical yet long-suppressed chapter in the Pacific War's closing days. The system that ensnared these women didn't emerge overnight. It was the result of deliberate imperial policy developed over years. The Japanese military first established comfort stations after the 1932 Shanghai incident, but the system expanded dramatically during the Sino-Japanese War and throughout World War II. By 1945, historical records indicate an estimated 50,000 to 200,000 women had been coerced or deceived into sexual servitude across Japanese-occupied territories. The majority came from Korea, which had been under Japanese colonial rule since 1910, but women from China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and other occupied territories were also victimized. The facility near Pyongyang, discovered by American forces that August day, was one of hundreds scattered across the Japanese Empire. According to military records later declassified, this particular station had been hastily abandoned by Japanese officers just days before American forces arrived. In their rush to retreat, the military personnel had left behind not only the women, but also significant documentation, logbooks, medical records, and administrative papers that would later provide critical evidence about how the system operated. Lieutenant James Forsyth of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division later recalled the moment in a 1993 interview for the U.S. Army Military History Institute. "We had no idea what we were walking into. Our intelligence had marked it as a supply depot or small garrison. The first woman we saw was standing in a doorway, so thin she barely looked alive. She didn't run or hide, just stared at us with a kind of vacant expression that I still remember clearly. Behind her were rooms, small cell-like spaces with mats on the floor. The smell was overwhelming, disease, human waste. Our medic, Johnson, immediately called for support. None of us had been prepared for this. The facility itself revealed the brutal efficiency of the system. Divided into sections with small compartments approximately 6 feet by 4 feet, each room contained only the most basic necessities: a thin sleeping mat, a wash basin, and in some cases a small personal box containing meager possessions. Military police documents recovered from the scene revealed that each woman was assigned a Japanese name and an identification number. Their Korean identities had been systematically erased, part of the comprehensive control mechanism established by their captors. The history that brought these women to this moment began years earlier, with Japan's colonial domination of Korea. After annexing the Korean peninsula in 1910, Japan implemented increasingly aggressive assimilation policies. By the 1930s, as Japan's military expansion accelerated across Asia, Korean society had been substantially transformed by colonial rule. Economic exploitation had created widespread poverty, particularly in rural areas. Educational opportunities were limited for Koreans, especially women, and economic opportunities were increasingly controlled by Japanese interests. It was against this backdrop that Japanese recruiters began targeting young Korean women. The methods of recruitment varied. Some women were directly abducted, others were deceived with false promises of legitimate work in factories or as nurses. According to testimonies compiled years later by researchers from Seoul National University, many families were coerced through threats or manipulated through small payments that seemed substantial to impoverished rural households. Kim Hak-soon, who would decades later become the first survivor to publicly testify about her experiences, was recruited in 1941 when she was 17. According to her 1991 testimony, she had been promised work in a factory making military uniforms. Her widowed mother had reluctantly agreed, desperate for the stipend offered by the recruiters. Only after being transported to China did Kim discover the true nature of her assignment. Her experience was tragically common. Young women from vulnerable circumstances transported far from home before learning they had been deceived. By 1942, the Japanese military had standardized these comfort stations across occupied territories. Military documents recovered after the war revealed a disturbing level of bureaucratic organization. The women were subjected to regular medical examinations to prevent venereal disease. Military personnel were allocated specific time slots and charged set fees, and detailed regulations governed the entire operation. These stations were explicitly designed to prevent the rape of local civilian populations by Japanese soldiers, not out of humanitarian concern, but to prevent anti-Japanese sentiment and maintain military discipline. The everyday reality for these women was one of extreme suffering. Military reports and survivor testimonies describe brutal conditions. Women were expected to serve multiple soldiers daily, with numbers increasing dramatically before and after major military operations. Physical resistance was met with severe beatings, torture, or even execution. Medical care was focused exclusively on preventing disease transmission to soldiers, not on women's well-being. Pregnancies, when they occurred, were typically terminated through forced abortions performed in primitive conditions, or occasionally resulted in births of children who were often taken away. American intelligence had received scattered reports about these comfort stations prior to the war's end, but the full scope and systematic nature of the program remained largely unknown until Allied forces began occupying Japanese territories. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Sheldon, who served with U.S. military intelligence in the Pacific Theater, noted in a declassified 1946 report, the Comfort Women system appears to have been much more extensive than initially understood. Information emerging from multiple liberated territories suggests a common operational structure and administrative approach, indicating central direction rather than ad hoc arrangements by field commanders. For the women at the Pyongyang facility, liberation came with profound complications. After years of captivity and abuse, they faced immediate challenges of physical recovery, psychological trauma, and uncertainty about their futures. American military medical personnel documented severe malnutrition, untreated diseases including tuberculosis and venereal diseases, and extensive physical injuries from abuse. Army nurse Sarah Reynolds wrote in her field notes, preserved in the National Archives, "Many patients exhibit signs of long-term physical trauma. Several have improperly healed fractures, extensive scarring, and chronic infections. Their psychological state is equally concerning. Most are withdrawn, avoid eye contact, and display signs of severe trauma." The immediate humanitarian response by American forces was complicated by linguistic barriers and cultural misunderstandings. Few American personnel spoke Korean, and the women's fear of foreign military men, regardless of nationality, created initial barriers to trust. Captain Robert Williams, a military physician assigned to the region, noted, "These women have every reason to distrust men in uniform. We're trying to demonstrate that our intentions are different, but the trauma they've experienced makes this exceptionally difficult." This distrust was compounded by the women's fear of social stigma. Many expressed concerns about returning to their communities where they feared rejection due to traditional Korean social norms regarding female chastity. Some had been missing for years, their families having no knowledge of their fate or whereabouts. Others feared they would never be able to marry or reintegrate into society if the nature of their captivity became known. One survivor, later identified only as Park in U.S. military assistance records, told an American interpreter, "How can I go home like this? My family thinks I went to work in a factory. If they know what happened to me, they will say I am dirty, that I have brought shame. Death would be better than such dishonor." These fears were tragically prescient. The cultural context of 1940s Korea meant many survivors would indeed face stigmatization rather than support. Traditional Confucian values emphasized female chastity as a measure of worth, with little accommodation for circumstances beyond a woman's control. While some families welcomed their daughters, sisters, and wives home regardless of what they had endured, others rejected them. Some survivors, facing such rejection and lacking other options, found themselves in precarious economic circumstances that led to continued sexual exploitation. As American forces established more stable occupation zones in southern Korea, medical personnel developed more comprehensive responses to the former comfort women's needs. Military authorities established temporary recovery centers, though resources were stretched thin by the enormous humanitarian challenges across formerly occupied territories. Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, one of the few female physicians serving with the U.S. Army in Korea, established a women's health clinic that prioritized treating former comfort women. Her medical logs, later preserved at the Truman Presidential Library, document the extensive physical rehabilitation required. Beyond treating acute conditions, we're addressing long-term malnutrition, reproductive damage from repeated untreated infections, and injuries that have improperly healed. Many patients require extensive dental work, having received no care for years. The psychological trauma proved even more challenging to address. American military psychiatrists, still developing their understanding of trauma from treating combat veterans, had limited frameworks for addressing sexual violence of this magnitude and duration. Dr. Howard Richardson, a military psychiatrist who interviewed several survivors, wrote in his October 1945 report, "These women exhibit symptoms similar to combat fatigue in soldiers, but with distinct characteristics related to sexual trauma and captivity. The combination of prolonged confinement, physical abuse, and sexual violence has created complex psychological injuries that our current treatment methods are inadequate to address." For American military authorities, the discovery of comfort stations posed political and diplomatic challenges. The United States was already developing plans for the occupation of Japan, focusing on demilitarization and democratization rather than war crimes prosecution. General Douglas MacArthur, who would lead the American occupation of Japan, prioritized stability and rapid reconstruction. Evidence suggests that comfort women issues were considered potentially destabilizing to occupation objectives. This pragmatic political calculus became evident in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo Trials, where prosecutors focused on conventional war crimes and crimes against peace, largely neglecting the systematic sexual enslavement of women. Despite substantial evidence, including captured military documents explicitly outlining the comfort women system, the issue received minimal attention. This omission would have profound consequences for survivors, effectively denying them recognition and justice for decades. As 1945 drew to a close, the immediate post-war chaos began resolving into new political realities. The Korean Peninsula, liberated from Japanese colonialism, now faced division along the 38th parallel, a temporary partition between Soviet and American occupation zones that would harden into one of the Cold War's most enduring boundaries. For comfort women survivors, this division created additional complications. Some found themselves separated from their home communities by an increasingly militarized border. Others faced new uncertainties as political tensions between emerging governments complicated repatriation efforts. In both North and South Korea, emerging political leaders focused on nation-building narratives that emphasized resistance to Japanese occupation rather than the complex and often painful realities of colonial collaboration and victimization. Comfort women survivors whose experiences didn't fit neatly into heroic resistance narratives found their histories marginalized or ignored. Their suffering became an uncomfortable reminder of national humiliation rather than a call for justice. This political reluctance to address the comfort women issue was not limited to Korean governments. The American occupation authorities in Japan focused on rapid reconstruction, and developing Japan as a Cold War ally against communism had little incentive to pursue justice for comfort women. Historian Sarah Johnson notes in her 2003 work, Forgotten Victims, documents from the occupation period reveal a calculated decision to downplay certain Japanese war crimes, particularly those like the comfort women system that might complicate occupation objectives or embarrass Japanese citizens who would be essential to rebuilding efforts. For individual survivors, the immediate post-liberation period was marked by difficult choices with limited options. Some managed to return to their families and communities, often maintaining silence about their experiences to avoid stigma. Others, rejected by families or unable to return home due to the political division of Korea, sought new beginnings in cities where anonymity provided some protection from judgment. A significant number found themselves in economically precarious circumstances, lacking education, job skills, or family support networks. American occupation authorities established limited assistance programs for displaced civilians, including former comfort women, but these programs were inadequate to address their specific needs. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, who worked with humanitarian assistance programs in Seoul, wrote in February 1946, "The women coming from these comfort stations require specialized medical care, psychological support, and economic assistance that our general aid programs simply aren't designed to provide. Without specific resources for their needs, many are falling through the cracks of our assistance framework." The emerging Cold War further complicated matters. As tensions between Soviet and American zones increased, humanitarian concerns increasingly took a backseat to strategic objectives. Resources for civilian recovery programs decreased as military priorities shifted toward potential conflict. By late 1946, American military documents show decreased attention to comfort women issues, with resources redirected toward broader economic stabilization and security concerns. This strategic shift had profound implications for how comfort women history would be documented and remembered. As Cold War imperatives reshaped American priorities in Asia, military intelligence records related to comfort women were classified, filed away, or in some cases destroyed during routine document purges. The institutional memory of what American forces had witnessed began to fade, preserved mainly in scattered personal accounts of military personnel rather than official historical records. For the women themselves, survival often depended on silence. Many survivors internalized their trauma, never speaking of their experiences, even to close family members. This silence was reinforced by societal attitudes that stigmatized victims of sexual violence rather than perpetrators. The shame and judgment many survivors feared would indeed have been their reality had they spoken openly. This collective silence, institutional, societal, and personal, created conditions for historical amnesia. By the early 1950s, as the Korean War reshaped the peninsula's political landscape and international attention focused on new conflicts, the comfort women system had faded from public consciousness in both Korea and the United States. What American soldiers had witnessed in those final days of World War II became a footnote rather than a recognized historical atrocity. The story of the American liberation of comfort women could have ended there, a momentary intersection of American and Korean history documented in scattered military reports but otherwise forgotten. The women themselves, carrying physical and psychological scars, largely disappeared into anonymous private lives or early graves. But history, especially that which involves profound injustice, has a way of resurfacing. In rural South Korea, an elderly woman named Kim Hak-soon watched the democratic movements of the late 1980s with growing interest. For decades, she had kept her experiences as a comfort woman locked away, sharing them with no one. But as South Korean society began confronting its authoritarian past and seeking historical truth, Kim made a momentous decision. In August 1991, she became the first survivor to publicly testify about her experiences. Her testimony, delivered at the age of 67, broke nearly 5 decades of silence. Kim's testimony catalyzed a movement that would eventually bring the comfort women issue back into international consciousness. Other survivors, inspired by her courage, began to come forward. Researchers and activists began seeking documentation, including American military records from the occupation period. The story of what American soldiers had witnessed in 1945, the conditions of the comfort stations, the state of the women they found, the evidence they collected became crucial historical validation for survivors whose accounts were being questioned or dismissed. For historians studying this period, American military records provided essential contemporaneous documentation. Reports filed by units that liberated comfort stations, medical evaluations conducted by Army physicians, intelligence assessments of the comfort women system, and photographs taken as evidence all became vital primary sources. These records, many declassified in the 1990s as interest in the issue increased, helped establish the systematic nature of the Comfort Women program and its connection to the highest levels of the Japanese military command structure. The experiences of comfort women liberated by American forces represented just one facet of a much larger system. As more survivors came forward and researchers gained access to previously classified documents, a clearer picture emerged of the global scale of this atrocity. Comfort stations had operated throughout Japanese-occupied territories, from Manchuria to Singapore, the Philippines to Burma. The experiences of Korean women, while representing the largest group of victims, were part of a multinational tragedy that affected women across Asia and the Pacific. The soldiers of the U.S. 24th Corps who encountered those Korean women near Pyongyang could not have anticipated how significant their documentation would become. Their field reports, photographs, and collected evidence, created for immediate military intelligence purposes, would decades later serve as crucial historical validation for women fighting for recognition and justice. First Lieutenant David Mitchell, who served with the U.S. Army's Military Government Section in Korea, reflected on this in a 1995 interview. "We were just doing our job, documenting what we found, trying to provide medical assistance, figuring out how to help these women return home if possible. None of us imagined that our paperwork would someday become important historical evidence in an international movement for justice. We were just witnesses to something terrible, trying to respond as humanely as we could in difficult circumstances." The American liberation of comfort women stations coincided with a broader awakening to the humanitarian challenges of the immediate post-war period. The U.S. military, designed and trained primarily for combat operations, found itself thrust into complex humanitarian roles across formerly Japanese-occupied territories. Military personnel had to rapidly adapt to addressing civilian needs, managing displaced populations, and responding to evidence of war crimes, often with limited preparation or resources for such tasks. Army Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, assigned to a medical unit supporting occupation forces in Korea, described this challenge in her personal diary, later donated to the Women's Military Service Memorial. "Our training prepared us for treating battlefield injuries, not the complex medical and psychological needs of women who've endured years of sexual slavery. We're doing our best with limited supplies and even more limited understanding of what these women have experienced. The language barrier makes everything more difficult, trying to explain medical procedures or simply offer comfort when we don't share a common language. For the Korean women encountering American military personnel, the experience was equally complex. After years of Japanese propaganda depicting Americans as barbaric enemies, Many initially feared their new liberators. Survivor accounts describe hiding when American soldiers first arrived, uncertain whether they represented new dangers or genuine liberation. This fear was compounded by the inherent power dynamic between armed military men and traumatized civilian women, as well as cultural and linguistic barriers that complicated communication. Gradually, as American medical personnel established treatment programs and female nurses became more involved, trust began to develop. American Women's Army Corps members proved particularly important in this process. Captain Mary Wilson, who served with the WSC in Korea, noted in her service records, "The Comfort Women survivors respond much more positively to female personnel. Many flinch or withdraw when approached by men in uniform, regardless of nationality. We've begun ensuring female medical staff and interpreters are present whenever possible during treatment and interviews." The medical challenges were substantial. Years of malnutrition had left many survivors with vitamin deficiencies, dental problems, and weakened immune systems. Untreated infections, particularly gynecological conditions, had created chronic health issues requiring specialized care. Injuries from physical abuse, broken bones that had healed improperly, scarring from cigarette burns and beatings, required assessment and often surgical intervention. The limited medical resources available in immediate post-war Korea meant American military medical personnel had to prioritize the most severe cases, often making difficult decisions about resource allocation. Beyond physical care, addressing the psychological trauma presented even greater challenges. The field of trauma psychology was still in its infancy, with concepts like post-traumatic stress disorder decades away from formal recognition. American military psychiatrists, working primarily from models developed for treating combat trauma in soldiers, had few effective frameworks for addressing the complex psychological effects of prolonged sexual violence and captivity. Dr. Robert Hayes, a military psychiatrist who treated several former Comfort women in Seoul, wrote in a December 1945 medical report, "These patients exhibit psychological symptoms that don't align with our standard diagnostic categories. They show extreme hypervigilance, persistent nightmares, emotional numbing, and sudden emotional distress triggered by environmental cues, particularly male voices speaking Japanese or uniforms. Our treatment approaches, largely based on brief intervention models, seem inadequate for trauma of this duration and nature. Despite these limitations, American medical personnel made significant efforts to provide compassionate care. They created specialized recovery wards when possible, worked with Korean interpreters to overcome language barriers, and attempted to adapt their approaches to cultural considerations. These efforts, while insufficient given the scale of need, represented an important humanitarian response that survivors later recalled with appreciation. For American military authorities, the discovery of Comfort Women stations also presented legal and investigative challenges. War crimes investigators attached to occupation forces collected evidence, interviewed survivors when possible, and documented findings for potential use in war crimes trials. Captain James Wilson, assigned to the Judge Advocate General's office supporting war crimes investigations, described the process in a 1946 memorandum. "We're gathering physical evidence, documenting conditions at these sites, and collecting testimony from both victims and any available witnesses. The challenge lies in connecting these operations to specific, responsible individuals within the Japanese command. Structure, establishing the chain of responsibility necessary for prosecution." This investigative work yielded substantial evidence. American forces recovered administrative documents detailing the operation of comfort stations, including regulations, financial records, and medical examination logs. They documented physical facilities, photographing the conditions in which women had been kept. They collected testimonies where survivors were willing to speak. This evidence painted a clear picture of a systematic program rather than isolated incidents, a distinction important for establishing war crimes charges. Yet, despite this evidence, the Comfort Women issue remained largely unaddressed in the Tokyo war crimes trials. The International Tribunal focused primarily on crimes against peace and conventional war crimes, gave minimal attention to sexual violence. Of the thousands of pages of trial proceedings, only a few brief mentions of comfort women appear. This omission reflected both the gender biases of the era and strategic decisions about prosecution priorities. For the Korean women liberated by American forces, this lack of justice compounded their suffering. Many had endured years of trauma only to find their experiences deemed insufficiently important for international accountability. The message this sent, that sexual violence against women was a secondary concern in evaluating war crimes, reinforced their marginalization and influenced how their stories would be remembered, or rather forgotten, in subsequent decades. The American occupation force's documentation of comfort women provided another crucial service, helping survivors locate their families when possible. Military government units established in South Korea maintained records of liberated women, creating a primitive database to help reconnect families separated by war and colonial policies. These efforts faced significant challenges, particularly as the division between North and South Korea hardened, making cross-border reunification increasingly difficult. For women whose home communities were now in North Korea, American military authorities attempted to arrange repatriation across the 38th parallel. These efforts met with mixed success. Soviet authorities controlling North Korea sometimes facilitated such returns, but often treated repatriation requests as low priorities compared to emerging Cold War concerns. As relations between occupation zones deteriorated, these humanitarian efforts became increasingly complicated by political considerations. Captain Thomas Reynolds, who worked with displaced person services in Seoul, noted the frustration this caused. "We have women here who know exactly where their families are, just a few miles away in some cases, but getting them home requires navigating an increasingly complex diplomatic situation. The human needs are clear, but the politics keep interfering with straightforward humanitarian solutions. For survivors who successfully returned to their communities, reintegration presented profound challenges. Korean society in 1945 remained deeply influenced by Confucian values regarding female chastity. Women who had been sexually violated, regardless of the circumstances, often faced stigma and discrimination. Many survivors chose not to reveal the truth about their experiences, creating cover stories about factory work or other legitimate employment to explain their absence during the war years. This silence, enforced by social pressure and internalized shame, created additional psychological burdens for women already traumatized by their experiences. Unable to speak openly about what they had endured, many had no outlet for processing their trauma or receiving social support. The psychological concept of disenfranchised grief, mourning that cannot be openly acknowledged or publicly validated, applies powerfully to their situation. American occupation authorities recognized these social dynamics but had limited capacity to address them. Cultural affairs officers working with the military government attempted some educational initiatives about sexual violence in warfare, but these efforts had minimal impact on deeply entrenched social attitudes. The pragmatic focus of occupation authorities on immediate stabilization rather than social transformation meant that challenging cultural stigmas received low priority. As 1946 progressed, American occupation policies increasingly focused on Cold War strategic concerns rather than addressing lingering wartime injustices. The emerging communist government in North Korea and rising tensions with Soviet authorities shifted American priorities toward security and political stability in South Korea. Resources for humanitarian assistance decreased, and attention to comfort women issues waned. By the time the formal American occupation of South Korea ended in 1948, the comfort women issue had been effectively marginalized in official policy considerations. For the survivors, this shift meant their window for receiving assistance or recognition was closing. As international attention moved to new crises and conflicts, their experiences receded from public consciousness. The women themselves, facing continuing stigma and limited economic opportunities, often struggled to rebuild their lives with little support. Many lived in poverty, their health permanently compromised by their wartime experiences and their educational and career opportunities, limited by gender discrimination and interrupted education. The silence surrounding comfort women experiences was maintained not only by societal pressures, but also by emerging government policies in both Korean states. In South Korea, successive authoritarian governments focused on economic development and anti-communist security, avoiding historical issues that might complicate diplomatic relationships with Japan. Increasingly seen as an important regional ally against communism. In North Korea, the government's Hughes ideology emphasized Korean resistance to Japanese colonialism, with little space for narratives of victimization that didn't serve current propaganda needs. This governmental reluctance to address comfort women history was reinforced by international Cold War dynamics. The United States focused on building Japan as a democratic bulwark against communism in Asia, had little incentive to press for accountability regarding war crimes that might destabilize Japanese society or create resistance to American occupation objectives. Documents from this period reveal a calculated decision to downplay certain aspects of Japan's wartime conduct to facilitate reconstruction and political transformation. For decades, this convergence of forces, social stigma, government silence, international strategic calculations, kept the comfort women issue largely hidden from historical memory. The women who had been liberated by American forces in 1945 aged, many dying without ever receiving acknowledgement or justice. Their stories remained untold, their suffering unrecognized, their needs unaddressed. The detailed records created by American military personnel were archived, classified, or forgotten in government repositories. This historical amnesia might have been permanent, if not for broader social and political changes. The democratization movements that transformed South Korean politics in the 1980s created space for previously suppressed historical narratives. The global women's rights movement provided new frameworks for understanding and addressing sexual violence. The end of the Cold War reduced some of the strategic imperatives that had contributed to official silence. In this changing context, survivors and activists began challenging the long-standing silence. Kim Hak-soon's 1991 testimony opened floodgates, with dozens of elderly women finally coming forward to share experiences they had kept hidden for nearly half a century. Researchers began seeking documentation, including the American military records that provided crucial contemporaneous evidence of what U.S. forces had witnessed in 1945. These efforts revealed the historical significance of those initial American encounters with comfort women. The careful documentation by military personnel created for immediate operational purposes in 1945 now served as vital historical evidence validating survivors' testimonies. Records that had sat unexamined in archives for decades became central to establishing historical truth and pressing for justice. The women's testimonies, combined with these historical records, revealed patterns that helped establish the systematic nature of the Comfort Women program. American military intelligence assessments from 1945-46, now declassified, showed contemporary understanding that the comfort stations represented an organized system rather than isolated incidents. These assessments noted similarities in operation across different geographical locations, standardized procedures for managing the stations, and evidence of central administrative direction from the Japanese military command. This documentation proved crucial as survivors and advocates pressed for recognition and justice. When Japanese government officials initially questioned the credibility of elderly women's memories or suggested the comfort stations were private operations rather than military institutions, American military records provided contradicting evidence. Photographs, facility diagrams, confiscated regulations, and intelligence reports all supported survivors' accounts and established the Japanese military's direct involvement. For the women themselves, this validation held profound significance. After decades of silence and suppression, their experiences were finally acknowledged as historical truth rather than dismissed as unverifiable claims. This recognition, while delayed by nearly half a century, provided a measure of the dignity and respect they had long been denied. The relationship between American forces and Korean comfort women in 1945 represents a complex historical intersection, a moment when American military personnel became unexpected witnesses to one aspect of Imperial Japan's wartime atrocities. The documentation they created, the assistance they provided, and the evidence they preserved would decades later become crucial to establishing historical truth and pursuing justice. Yet their role was also complicated by subsequent policy decisions that prioritized Cold War strategic objectives over accountability for these crimes against women. This complexity reminds us that historical events rarely have simple narratives or clear moral boundaries. The American soldiers who encountered these women in 1945 responded with humanity to an immediate humanitarian crisis. Yet the government they represented would soon make policy decisions that effectively abandoned the pursuit of justice for these same women. The detailed records they created would eventually serve justice, but only after decades of institutional neglect. For the Korean women at the center of this history, the American liberation brought an end to their immediate captivity, but not to their suffering. Physical and psychological trauma, social stigma, economic hardship, and the absence of justice or recognition would continue to shape their lives long after American forces had departed. Their liberation was real but incomplete, the beginning of a different kind of struggle rather than an end to their ordeal. As survivors began speaking publicly in the 1990s, they described the complex emotions they experienced during those first encounters with American soldiers. For many, the overwhelming sensation was disbelief that their captivity was genuinely ending, that they might survive, that someone had come who didn't intend them harm. This disbelief often manifested as emotional numbness, an inability to process the sudden transformation of their circumstances after years of traumatic predictability. Survivor Lee Young-soo, who was 16 when American forces discovered the comfort station where she was held, described this moment in her 2007 testimony to the U.S. Congress. "When American soldiers came, I felt nothing at first. I had forgotten how to feel hope. They offered us chocolate and tried to tell us we were free, but I didn't understand their words or believe their kindness was real. I had learned that men in uniforms meant pain. It took many days before I could believe this nightmare might be ending." For the American soldiers, encountering comfort women represented a different kind of shock, confronting evidence of systematic atrocity that exceeded even their experiences of combat. Many had fought across the Pacific, witnessed the brutality of island warfare, and seen civilians suffering throughout the campaign. Yet the comfort women system, with its industrialized approach to sexual exploitation, represented something different: the bureaucratization of sexual violence as military policy. This recognition is evident in contemporaneous documents. Major William Harrison, writing in an intelligence assessment in September 1945, noted, "What distinguishes these comfort stations is their systematic organization and administrative integration with military operations. This was not random exploitation, but a calculated program, complete with regulations, medical protocols, and administrative oversight. The women were treated as military supplies rather than human beings. The immediate post-liberation period created an unusual intersection of traumatized Korean women and American military personnel attempting to provide assistance. This interaction was shaped by profound barriers, linguistic, cultural, experiential, yet also by genuine humanitarian intent. American military nurses and female support personnel proved especially important in this process, providing care that male medical staff couldn't effectively deliver given the survivors' psychological state. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, who served with the Army Nurse Corps in Korea, described these challenges in her service memoir. These women had experienced such profound violations that establishing trust seemed almost impossible. "We worked through Korean interpreters, usually older women when we could find them, and relied heavily on nonverbal communication. Simple things like offering a blanket sitting rather than standing when speaking with them, or ensuring they had privacy during examinations. These small gestures of respect seemed to matter enormously. American military authorities established temporary recovery facilities where possible, converting available buildings into rudimentary women's clinics and recovery centers. These facilities faced significant resource constraints. Medical supplies were limited, qualified personnel were stretched thin, and competing humanitarian priorities demanded attention. Yet they represented an important acknowledgement of the women's specific needs and experiences. Dr. Margaret Wilson, a civilian physician working with occupation authorities, implemented innovative approaches at one such facility in Seoul. Her clinical notes detail efforts to create culturally appropriate care. We've incorporated Korean healing traditions where possible, working with local women to provide familiar food, herbal remedies, and comfort items. We've learned that recovery requires not just Western medical treatment, but restoration of cultural connection and identity that was systematically stripped away during their captivity. For many survivors, these immediate post-liberation services represented their only experience of formal assistance or recognition. As occupation priorities shifted and resources were redirected to emerging Cold War concerns, even these limited services were reduced or eliminated. By late 1946, most specialized programs for former comfort women had been discontinued, with survivors directed to general civilian assistance programs if any support remained available. This pattern, initial recognition and response followed by policy shifts that marginalized their needs, would characterize much of the comfort women's subsequent history. Their experiences, documented in that moment of liberation and immediate aftermath, would fade from official attention until survivors themselves forced a reckoning decades later. The American soldiers who encountered Korean comfort women in those final days of World War II could not have anticipated how their actions and documentation would eventually serve history. The reports they filed, the photographs they took, the evidence they collected, and the medical assistance they provided all became part of a historical record that would eventually help establish truth and pursue justice. Their role as witnesses, creating contemporaneous documentation of what they found, would prove crucial for validating survivors' testimonies after decades of silence and denial. For the Korean women who experienced this liberation, the American arrival marked not an end, but a transition from one form of suffering to another. Physical captivity ended, but the legacy of trauma, social stigma, economic marginalization, and absence of justice continued to shape their lives. Liberation brought freedom but not healing, escape but not resolution. Their journey toward recognition and justice would continue for decades, with most survivors dying before seeing meaningful accountability. This history reminds us that moments of liberation, while essential, are rarely complete or uncomplicated. The American soldiers who opened the gates of comfort stations in 1945 brought genuine freedom, yet the society these women returned to offered limited acceptance or understanding. True liberation, including recognition, justice, and healing, would require much more than the physical act of rescue. The historical significance of the comfort women's system extends far beyond the specific experiences of Korean women liberated by American forces in 1945. It represents one of the largest organized systems of sexual slavery in modern warfare, with implications for how we understand military sexual violence, wartime accountability, and the long-term impacts of sexual trauma on survivors and societies. The systematic nature of the program, its bureaucratic organization, administrative procedures, and integration with military operations makes it a particularly important case study in how sexual violence can be weaponized as military policy. In the decades following liberation, the survivors' experiences remained largely unaddressed in official histories and public consciousness. The combined forces of social stigma, government silence, and international politics created a form of institutional amnesia that effectively erased their suffering from historical memory. This erasure compounded their trauma, denying them not only justice, but the basic acknowledgement of what they had endured. The long silence surrounding comfort women history reveals how powerful forces shape historical memory, determining which experiences are commemorated and which are forgotten. Gender, national interest, international politics, and cultural taboos all influenced the marginalization of comfort women experiences in official narratives. Their history reminds us that historical truth often depends not only on what happened, but on who has the power to ensure events are remembered or forgotten. When survivors began speaking publicly in the 1990s, they faced skepticism and denial from Japanese government officials and some historians. The existence of American military documentation from 1945 proved crucial in this context. Contemporary reports, photographs, medical records, and collected evidence provided verification that couldn't be dismissed as faulty memory or political fabrication. The detailed records created by American military personnel in those immediate post-liberation days became vital historical evidence validating survivors' long-suppressed testimonies. This belated recognition has profound implications for understanding justice and its timeline. For most comfort women survivors, justice was delayed beyond their lifetimes. The majority died without receiving formal apology, compensation, or even acknowledgement of what they had endured. Their experiences challenge conventional understandings of justice and reconciliation, raising difficult questions about what justice means when it comes too late for those who suffered most directly. For historians studying this period, the comfort women system illustrates how gender shapes both wartime experience and historical memory. While military histories have traditionally focused on combat operations, strategic decisions, and political leadership, the experiences of women, both as victims and as participants in war efforts, have often been marginalized or ignored. The comfort women history demonstrates the importance of integrating gender analysis into understanding warfare and its impacts. The systematic sexual exploitation of Korean women also reveals important dimensions of Japanese colonial rule in Korea. Beyond economic extraction and political control, colonialism enabled the physical appropriation of Korean women's bodies for Japanese military purposes. This gendered dimension of colonial power, the ability to control, transport, and exploit colonized women, represents an important aspect of how imperial systems functioned. American forces encountering comfort women in 1945 witnessed the intersection of multiple systems of power: Japanese imperialism, military authority, patriarchal control of women's sexuality, and colonial subjugation. Their documentation of these systems, while created for immediate military intelligence purposes, now serves as crucial historical evidence of how these power structures operated in practice, rather than just in theory. For contemporary military organizations, the comfort women history offers important lessons about preventing sexual violence in conflict zones. The systematic nature of the Comfort Women program, its organization, administration, and integration with military operations demonstrates how sexual violence can become institutionalized within military structures rather than existing as isolated incidents. This understanding informs current efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence through international law, military codes of conduct, and accountability mechanisms. The Comfort Women history also illuminates the long-term consequences of wartime sexual violence for survivors and societies. The physical and psychological trauma experienced by these women didn't end with liberation, but continued throughout their lives. Many suffered chronic health conditions, psychological distress, economic hardship, and social isolation for decades. Their experiences demonstrate that the costs of wartime sexual violence extend far beyond the immediate conflict period, creating lifelong impacts for survivors and intergenerational trauma for families and communities. For the women liberated by American forces in 1945, that moment represented both an ending and a beginning. The conclusion of their physical captivity, but the start of a different kind of struggle for recovery, reintegration, and eventually recognition. The American soldiers who encountered them became unexpected witnesses to an atrocity that would take decades to be fully acknowledged. Their documentation, created in that moment of liberation, would eventually serve as crucial evidence in establishing historical truth. The intersection of American military history and Korean comfort women experiences in 1945 reminds us that historical events create unexpected connections across cultures and generations. The soldiers who documented what they found likely never imagined their reports would become vital evidence in an international movement for justice decades later. Yet, their actions in that moment, recording what they witnessed, providing what assistance they could, preserving evidence of what had occurred, created a historical record that would eventually help break decades of silence. For the Korean women at the center of this history, the American liberation brought an end to one form of suffering, but not to their struggle for dignity and recognition. Their experiences, documented by American forces in 1945, suppressed for decades, and finally acknowledged in the 1990s, stand as testimony to both the depths of human cruelty and the persistence of the human drive for truth and justice. Their history reminds us that liberation is not a moment but a process, one that for these women would span decades, with most never living to see its completion.